The debrief lasted 4 hours. When it ended, Sergeant Nkosi Dlamini walked out of the transit terminal on Meridian Station and stood at the viewport for a long time, watching the stars refuse to move. He had been gone for 6 years. 6 years inside the corridor war, folded inside ships that smelled of recycled breath and machine oil, sleeping in berths barely wide enough to turn over in. 6 years of communication blackouts, of living inside someone else's orders, of becoming so fluent in the language of survival that ordinary speech, "How are you? What do you want for dinner? Do you remember when?" had started to sound like a dialect he no longer spoke. Now the war was done, or at least the shooting part of it was. The Varric had retreated to their inner systems. The treaty was being drafted somewhere deep in the diplomatic tier, in rooms with soft lighting and water glasses, by people who had never once thrown themselves flat on a carbon-scared hull, while the vacuum tried to swallow them whole. Nkosi watched the stars and waited to feel something about that. He waited a long time. Behind him in the terminal, the arrivals lounge hummed with the particular sound of an institution at rest. Distant PA announcements. The click of someone's boots on composite flooring. The low murmur of a news feed nobody was really watching. Projected on the screen above the departures board, a coalition spokesperson was saying the word peace in several languages. It sounded like a rumor in every one of them. "They're going to give us 3 days," said a voice beside him. Kosi didn't need to look. He already knew the voice, had known it for 6 years across a dozen engagements. Through a punctured suit on Cathara 9 and a collapsed tunnel on the third moon of Dyrus Reach, Sifo Hadabi was shorter than Nkosi, by half a head and broader through the shoulders than anyone had any right to be after 6 years on combat rations. He had a scar that ran from his left temple almost to his ear, courtesy of a Varric dispersal round that had grazed him at Meridian 3. He wore it like something he didn't think about much, which was how Sifo wore most things. 3 days and then what, Nkosi said. Reassignment, administrative processing. They're calling it transition integration. Sifo said the phrase the way you'd say something in a language you don't trust. Sounds like being slowly digested. "It is," said the third voice, and Nkosi turned. Precious Ndlovu was leaning against the viewport strut with her arms folded. She was the only one of them who had come through the war without a visible scar, which was either luck or a kind of armor Nkosi couldn't name. She had a way of watching people that had served her well as a signal specialist, patient, precise, missing nothing. She was watching the departure board now, with the expression she wore when she'd already run the numbers and didn't like the answer. "They discharged Vusi's whole unit last month," she said. 8 of them. 3 have apartments. 2 are still in transit barracks. The other 3 are sleeping in an emergency shelter in the outer ring. Nobody said anything to that for a moment. The PA system made a sound in throat and announced a departing shuttle. "Well," Sifo said finally, "we won the war." He didn't say it bitterly. That was the thing about Sifo. He had a way of stating the worst truths with a kind of level calm, as if they were just weather conditions you needed to account for. Nkosi had seen him assess a collapsed trench line with the same measured detachment. It wasn't coldness. It was the opposite of coldness. It was the thing that kept you from shattering when the cold hit. Nkosi looked back at the stars. They're out there, beyond the systems he could name. The Varric were doing whatever Varric did in the absence of war. Nobody really knew. That was the other thing about this war. 6 years of bleeding against an enemy they still barely understood. The Varric had not come to conquer or colonize in any way humans could map. They did not broadcast demands or ultimatums. They had arrived in the corridor systems and begun methodically dismantling infrastructure, comms relays, fuel depots, terraforming stations, with a patience that suggested they had been planning it for a very long time. When humans resisted, the Varric adjusted their tactics. When humans found a pattern in the adjustments, the Varric changed the pattern. You fought them the way you'd fight an argument with someone who had never once in their life needed to be right, only to prevail. What broke them, what finally, genuinely broke them, was something the military strategists were still arguing about. The official account said it was the combined fleet action at Meridian 3, the biggest engagement of the war. Nkosi had been there. He'd seen how close Meridian 3 had come to going the other way. He didn't trust the official account. What he trusted was this. At some point in the last year, the Varrock had started losing their certainty. Small things. Response times that were fractionally too slow. Formations that allowed for margins they hadn't allowed before. Positions held past the point of rational defense, and then abandoned in ways that looked almost like surprise, as if something about the human response kept arriving in a shape they hadn't predicted and couldn't quite absorb. He'd thought about it often in the months since, lying in his bunk after an engagement, staring at the underside of the berth above him, trying to work out what it was that humans did that the Varrock couldn't model. Not the courage. Courage was chemistry. It was training. It was desperation. The Varrock had their own version of all of those. Not the weapons. The Varrock's weapons were superior in most categories for the first 4 years of the war. Not the tactics. Something else. He hadn't found the word for it yet. Train boards in an hour, Precious said, unfolding her arms. I found us a place. What kind of place? Sifo said. Old, kind. Ask too many questions until you see it. The transit down to the surface took 40 minutes through atmosphere that was still healing from the early days of the war, when the Varrock had targeted industrial nodes and left a chemical signature in the air that the recovery teams were still working against. The train window showed Nkosi's a landscape he recognized in broad strokes and didn't recognize in detail. The proportions were right. The distances between settlements were where his memory had filed them. But the details were wrong. Buildings that hadn't been there before. Roads rerouted around damage that had since been cleared, but left the new route because by now, that's just where the road was. The city of his memory was a palimpsest underneath the city that had learned to survive without him. He had a mother in that city. Or rather, there was a woman in that city who had been his mother before the war, and he supposed she still occupied that position. But he had not spoken to her in 14 months due to communications restrictions, and he had no clear picture of who she'd become in the gap. He was aware that the same was true from her side. The person she was going to see step off this train was not the person she'd last seen board one. He thought about calling ahead and decided against it. There was something about the idea of announcing himself that felt wrong, like it would give her time to prepare a face. He wanted to see the real one. He understood this was unfair and did it anyway. The apartment Precious had found was in the sunken quarter. That was what people were calling the neighborhood now, though it had been called something else before the Varrock bombardment had dropped 2 city blocks by several meters. The subsidence had been stabilized, the structural damage repaired, but the elevation difference remained. So, the streets in that sections ran about 4 meters lower than the surrounding grid, connected by ramp stairs and service lifts, making the whole neighborhood feel like a place that had gone underground to survive and decided to stay there. The apartment itself was on the 3rd floor of a building that had been a hotel before the war and had been converted to mixed residential in the reconstruction. 3 bedrooms, a common room that faced west, a kitchen with a gas line that still worked intermittently. It's not permanent, Precious said, dropping her kit bag by the door. Month to month. It's ours until we figure out what comes next. Sifo stood in the middle of the common room and turned around slowly, taking it in with his damage assessment expression. Cracked plaster above the window. Scorch mark on the ceiling from some previous occupant's gas incident. A view of the ramp stair, opposite where 3 kids were doing something complicated with a makeshift ramp and what looked like a salvaged cargo sled. It's perfect, he said, in the same tone he used for everything. The first thing Nkosi did, after they'd stowed their gear and Sifo had set about making something edible from the sparse contents of the welcome pack the building manager had left, was go see his mother. She lived 12 minutes away on foot, on the 3rd floor of a building that had not been hit during the war, but had developed a list that might have been stress damage, and might just have been age. He stood outside on the street below her window for a moment, looking up at it. A light was on. He could see the shadow of the ceiling lamp he'd bought her the year before he deployed. A simple thing, an articulated arm that let you move the light around, which she'd wanted for reading. He rang her calm. She answered on the 2nd ring, said his name exactly once, in a voice that did something complicated, and told him to come up. She had aged. He'd expected it, but expecting a thing and being confronted with it are different countries. The 6 years sat on her differently than they sat on him. Not harder, not softer, just differently. There was a composure to her that he didn't remember from before, the composure one who had made a number of adjustments to reality and learned to live in the adjusted version. She looked at him for a long time in the doorway before she stepped aside to let him in, and he understood that she was doing the same inventory on him. Thin, she said, which was the kind of thing she was allowed to say. Not as thin as I was, he told her. She made tea. He sat at the same kitchen table where he'd done homework as a child, and noticed that the chair he'd always used had been reupholstered in a fabric he didn't recognize, and felt something about that he couldn't name. They talked for an hour. Careful talk at first, the kind that builds a bridge one plank at a time before you trust it with any weight. Gradually the talk got easier. She told him about the neighborhood during the war, the rationing and the blackouts, and the one night a Varec probe had done a low pass over the city, and she'd stood on the roof and watched it move across the sky like something from a story someone else's god had written. She said she hadn't been frightened, which surprised her. She said she'd been angry, which didn't. He told her as much as he could, which was less than he wanted. Some of it he wasn't cleared to discuss. Some of it he wasn't yet capable of discussing. He could reach for the words, but they weren't attached to anything, yet floating free from the experience they were supposed to describe. She seemed to understand this and didn't push. When he left, she walked him to the door and held his face between her hands for a moment, the way she had when he was small, and looked at him. You came back, she said. Yes, good, she said. That's what mattered. He walked back through the sunken quarter in the early evening light. The ramp stairs were lit from below. Now the kids with the cargo sled replaced by a pair of older residents in conversation. Someone somewhere was playing music through an open window. Something with a slow rhythm and a lot of brass. The kind of music that didn't insist on being heard, but simply occupied space and made it warmer. He stood at the top of one of the ramp stairs for a moment, looking down at the lowered streets, and thought about what his mother had said. That's what mattered. It should have felt like enough. He tried to make it feel like enough. The transition office was in a reclaimed administrative block 3 kilometers from the quarter, staffed by 3 people who were managing approximately 400 returning veterans on a caseload that the system had manifestly not been designed to handle. Nkosi went on day 2. He sat across from a woman named Counselor Thembeka Ross, who had a stack of forms in front of her, and the expression of someone doing genuine good work with inadequate tools. She was kind. She was efficient. She explained to him that his rank entitled him to priority housing assistance, which had a current wait time of 7 to 9 months. She explained that his combat designation made him eligible for vocational retraining through the Defense Transition Scheme, which had a current enrollment backlog of approximately 14 months. She explained all of this with the bedside manner of someone delivering news they didn't make, which was the only honest way to deliver it. What would you like to do, she asked, if you had your choice? Nobody had asked him that in 6 years. He sat with the question for a moment, turning it over. It was strange. He'd had 6 years of hypothetical conversations with himself in ships and tunnels and bivouacs, countless hours of imagining the answer to exactly this question, and now the question was real, and the answer had gone somewhere. I don't know yet, he said, which was the first completely honest thing he'd said to anyone in several days. She nodded, as if that was a perfectly reasonable place to be. Sifo found work first, which nobody was surprised about. He'd always been the one who could translate skills from one context to another without losing much in the transfer. He had spent 4 years of the war working with heavy structural repair equipment, patching breaches, clearing debris, stabilizing damaged hulls under combat conditions. Within a week of discharge, he was working for a reconstruction contractor in the outer ring, 12-hour days, manual labor, coming back to the apartment with the particular exhausted purposefulness of someone who knows exactly what they did that day and can point to it. Precious was more complicated. She'd been signals intelligence. The skills were valuable, in theory, to a dozen different employers. Practice, The specific systems she was qualified on were classified, and the work she'd done couldn't be described in an interview. And sitting across from a recruiter trying to explain that you knew how to do things you weren't allowed to say was its own kind of war. She spent the first 2 weeks writing code for herself. Nothing commercially useful. Just the kind of procedural problems she set herself when she needed to think. Loops and recursive functions filling screens in the common room at 2 in the morning. Nkosi walked through the sunken quarter every day. He wasn't sure what he was looking for. He visited his mother twice more, and the visits grew easier, the bridge between them strengthening as they added planks. He helped Sifo haul materials on a Saturday when the crew was short-handed and realized he'd missed the particular satisfaction of physical work. Not the violence kind, not the survival kind, but the kind that leaves something standing when you're done. On the 9th day, he found the building. It was on the lower level of the sunken quarter, near where the subsidence had been most severe. The city had stabilized the structure years ago, but not reclaimed it. It sat in a kind of administrative limbo, owned by the municipality, not condemned but not repurposed, its windows intact, its entrance sealed with a standard lockout panel. He stood outside it for a long time. It had been a community space before the war. He could tell from the proportions. The high-ceilinged main room, visible through the ground-level windows. The stage at the far end, the double-width entrance. Something like a gathering hall or a performance venue. The subsidence had taken it 6 meters down, which was why no commercial developer had claimed it. The access geometry was awkward. The ramp approach narrow. From inside he imagined it would sit below street level with those high windows, catching the late afternoon light from an angle no street-level building got. He contacted the municipal development office the next morning. The process took 3 months. That part Nkosi had not expected to be easy, and was not surprised to find difficult. The paperwork was multi-layered, the bureaucratic pathways branching and reconnecting in ways that required a certain stubbornness to navigate. The stubbornness of someone who has learned that the answer to a wall is usually to find the door, and the answer to no door is to ask again, and the answer to no is to wait and ask again better. Sifo helped with the structural assessment. Precious found 2 separate grant programs the development office hadn't mentioned, including one specifically for veteran-led community initiatives that nobody at the transition office had known about. The building manager in their block, a man named Gert, who had survived the war by being the last person in any room to panic, turned out to have a contact in municipal planning who thought what Nkosi was trying to do was, as she put it, the first genuinely good idea to come through her desk in 18 months. They applied. They waited. They applied again with supplementary documentation. They were asked to present their proposal to a review board, which Nkosi did in a room with bad lighting, and 3 people who asked the same question in different forms. What makes you think this will work? He told them the truth, which was that he didn't know for certain but had enough certainty to try, and that the neighborhood needed it, and that needing a thing and having someone willing to build it was usually where things started. The license was granted on a Tuesday afternoon in the 4th month. Precious received the confirmation on her comm and read it aloud in the kitchen to Nkosi and Sifo, who were eating something Sifo had made from leftover construction site rations. Because there was a poetry to it. Doing this, she said. We already were, Sifo said. The renovation took 4 more months. Sifo led it the way he'd led everything he'd ever led. Not loudly, not with speeches, but with the particular authority of someone who knows what to do next, and is already doing it when you look for them. He pulled in 2 former crewmates from the war who'd come home to find themselves adrift, and then 2 of their contacts, and then a couple of neighborhood residents who'd heard what was happening and wanted to be part of it. And the crew grew by accretion the way things do when they have sufficient momentum and enough visible purpose. Did everything that needed doing, which was mostly everything. Ticked. He ran the permit applications and the supply orders, and the creditor negotiations and the community consultations, and somewhere in the middle of all of it, he stopped walking through the quarter looking for something and started walking through it, knowing where he was going. There was one afternoon. He remembered it clearly later. as a kind of marker. When he was up on a scaffold near the ceiling of the main room, helping run new cable for the lighting rig, and he heard Sifo below him explaining a load-bearing modification to one of the younger workers. And the explanation was patient and precise and completely without condescension, and the young worker was listening with the focused attention of someone learning something real. And the late afternoon light was coming through the angled windows, exactly as Nkosi had imagined it would, falling across the old stage in long gold bars, and he had the thought, this is what we were holding. The territory, not the systems the ability to take a space that was broken and go back to it and make it into something people could come to. The specific human stubbornness of returning. He didn't understand the Varek retreat until much later, until a year after the war ended, when a team of xenobiologists and communication theorists released a classified summary that filtered its way eventually into a series of briefings for senior non-commissioned officers. Kosi read it 3 times. The Varek were not, as most of the war's analysis had assumed, engaged in resource extraction or territorial expansion. The military had been wrong about the objective, which was why the military's predictive models had consistently failed to anticipate Varek behavior at the operational level. The Varek were studying. They were learning, specifically. They were attempting to model the behavioral logic of another intelligent species. And the Corridor War was, from their perspective, something closer to an extended experiment than a campaign. What had disrupted them? What had finally broken their models badly enough that retreat became preferable to continued engagement was something the briefing described as behavioral unpredictability compounded by what it called contextual emotional investment, meaning humans kept doing things the Varek hadn't predicted, and the reason they hadn't predicted it was that the things humans did were attached to a web of meaning, loyalty to specific individuals, attachment to specific places, the gravitational pull of a particular home or particular person, that the Varek had no framework to model and therefore could not adequately factor. Calculate the variable of someone who would do something costly, strategically dubious, and operationally irregular because of who they were going back to. You couldn't account for the kind of stubbornness that had nothing to do with winning the fight and everything to do with what was on the other side of it. Proof. Nkosi read the briefing in the main room of the community space on a Sunday afternoon, 6 months after they'd opened it to the neighborhood. Outside in the ramp-stair street below, he could hear the noise of the weekly market that had started using the forecourt. Vendors, the particular communal roar of commerce and proximity, kids shouting. Above him, the lighting rig he and the young workers had run was doing its job. On the stage, a quartet of musicians were rehearsing something for the next weekend's program, running the same difficult transition over and over with the cheerful patience of people who know it'll click eventually. He thought about standing at that viewport on Meridian Station, watching the stars refuse to move, trying to feel something about the war being over. He understood now what he hadn't been able to feel then. It hadn't been over. The part that mattered hadn't started yet. He told Precious about the briefing over dinner. She read it on her comm and ate in silence for a while. Behavioral unpredictability, she said. So we won because we were irrational. We won because we were attached, Nkosi said. Same thing, from their side. Different thing from ours. She considered this. Outside, the market was winding down, vendors packing up, the noise shifting from commerce to a quieter, end-of-day register. The specific sound of a neighborhood that has done a day's work and is now doing the thing that comes after. You know what I keep thinking about, Precious said. That probe. My mother told me, watched it quiet cross the sky on one of the bad nights, when the bombardment was close enough that she could feel it in her chest. She said she wasn't frightened. She said she was angry. She paused. She said she thought, this is my city. As if that was an argument. It was, Nkosi said. Precious looked at him. Yeah, she said. Sifo had found a girl. He announced it in the way Sifo announced most things. Without ceremony. As a statement of existing fact that everyone else simply hadn't been informed of yet. Her name was Dio. She worked in environmental restoration, replanting the biocorridors damaged by the industrial strikes. She came to the community space the following Friday, and sat beside Sifo on the chairs they'd arranged against the back wall, watching the first formal event they'd staged. A panel discussion, badly attended, but enthusiastically attended by the ones who'd shown up, on reconstruction priorities in the sunken quarter. After, she helped stack chairs and told Nkosi that the space had good bones. He agreed that it did. "The bones are the hard part," she said. "Everything else is just work." He thought about that for a while. The community space opened fully in the 6th month. They called it what it was, a gathering place. No complex name, no branding. The words spread in the neighborhood the way useful things spread, which is by being used and then being mentioned to someone who hadn't known about it yet. True. Within 8 weeks of opening, they were running programs 4 evenings a week, music, community meetings, a language exchange that had started with 2 participants and grown to 11, a Saturday morning program for kids that had started as a structured activity and evolved into something looser and better, the kind of self-organizing system that makes you believe in people. Nkosi ran the administration. He had found, to his moderate surprise, that he was good at it in ways the war had not predicted. Not the fighting kind of administration, the moving resources toward contact kind, but the quieter and more patient kind. The kind that required you to hold a large number of variables in mind simultaneously and treat the unexpected ones as information rather than threats. He held a lot of in mind: the permit renewals, the grant cycle, the maintenance budget versus the programming budget, and the ongoing negotiation between them. The community board they'd established, 12 people representing different parts of the quarter's demographic, who met monthly and were gradually becoming the thing they were supposed to be, which was a body of people who had opinions about a shared space, and enough trust in the process to argue them out. The 2 former crewmates Sifo had pulled in, who were now, in small increments, reassembling lives they could live in. The young worker, who'd listened to Sifo's explanation on the scaffold and who was now, six months later, enrolled in a structural engineering program with a recommendation letter from the municipal planning contact, who'd pushed their permit through. He held all of it, and it was heavy, and it was worth the wait. 14 months after discharge, Counselor Thembeka Ross came to the community space on a Saturday morning. She came because someone had referred her in her professional capacity. There were 3 recently discharged veterans in the quarter who she was struggling to reach through the formal channels and who someone had told her were spending time here. She found them. She also found, as she told Nkosi later over tea in the kitchen, that the space was the most effective transition support resource she'd encountered in her work, with the distinction of not being designated as a transition support resource at all. Which is probably why it works, she said. Probably, Nkosi agreed. How did you know it would? He thought about standing at the viewport on Meridian Station, with the stars that wouldn't move, and the PA system saying peace in 6 languages, and Sifo saying we won the war in his weather report voice. "I didn't," he said. "I had enough certainty to try. That's all you ever have." She nodded and wrote something in her notes, and he didn't ask what. The night they held the first anniversary event, 1 year since the doors had opened. The main room was full. Cassie stood at the back, against the far wall, and watched it the way Precious watched things, with the patience of someone not trying to interfere. The musicians were better. The kids who'd come to the first Saturday morning program were in the audience now, older by a year, operating in the space with the proprietary ease of people who've decided something is theirs to care about. Sifo was at the front with Dio. Precious was somewhere near the stage, arguing about something with Gert, the building manager. And, from the expression on both their faces, it was the good kind of argument, the kind that ends in something getting fixed. His mother was there. She started coming regularly. Not every week, but enough that the regulars knew her, said hello by name, included her in the small ceremonies of belonging that constitute a community. She was talking to an elderly man Nkosi didn't recognize, and she was laughing at something, and the reading lamplight was warm above her. And he had the thought, brief, decisive, the kind of thought that doesn't need to be examined, that this was the thing he'd been fighting for without knowing its name. Principle, not a territory, not a treaty line on a star map. This room, these people. The specific gravity of a place that people chose to come back to. He remembered reading that the Varek had studied humans for years before the war, had developed extensive models of human behavior, had been, by all accounts, confident. He understood that confidence, because he'd felt it from the inside. The certainty of analysis, the comfort of a model that fit the known data. The Varek had been good scientists. They'd just been studying the wrong variable. They'd modeled the mechanics of human behavior and missed the weight at the center of it. The stubborn, inconvenient, operationally inconvenient fact of being from somewhere and going back to it, and building something worth going back to. You couldn't calculate that. You couldn't predict it. Only be it, and be it again. And keep being it past the point where any rational model would have told you to stop. He pushed off from the wall and went to find his mother, to introduce her to whoever she was laughing with, to be present in the room that was his to be present in. Outside, the sunken quarter hummed with itself. Markets folded for the night. Music leaking from windows. The ramp stairs lit yellow from below. Kids on the corner, doing something complicated and self-invented. A neighborhood that had gone underground to survive, and had, in the underground, found a way to be itself. He was home. Not the home he'd left, the one he'd built. The one that had been here, sunk below street level, waiting for someone to come back to it. Waiting for someone stubborn enough to come back.